Prospective hire. The city smells warlike, waiting, like you're standing on ground where a trench will soon be dug, and all the buildings must sense it in their foundations when they fruitlessly attempt to escape reality skyward. Imminent doom refracted prismatically by concrete into shapeless, unmitigated portend. You know the feeling intimately, but you'll never get used to the smell. Most people can't tell it apart from normal soil, you've learned, and maybe that's not surprising. Next to all soil will give way to a trench at some point or another, so perhaps they just have keener noses than you. Unlikely, but possible. You want to call it a shame for the modern architecture, but even the desire rings of insincerity when your eyes already make of the glass, steel and concrete nothing but cover and watchtowers, staples of a war to come. Also rubble. Mostly rubble. Those sleek office towers serve other functions in their off time, sure. They serve masters more at home on the accounting side of atrocity. But our jobs have a habit of predisposing us to certain perspectives more than others. Callings lead the impressionable by catching first their eyes, and then the rest, with different details, all just as resonant as they are arbitrary. But that's the beauty of the whole thing, isn't it? Farmers and cooks look at animals quite differently, you hear. Occupational hazard. It's not that much harm has ever come around to befall you, personally, but common wisdom would still count soldiers amongst the ranks of more hazardous occupations, not just in terms of outlook skew. Death captures the human imagination far more skillfully than the nuances of perception, after all, which you think is tragic. Probably. One often does result in the other, circles back into unfamiliar intensities and dissolves the internal dissonance. Perhaps you must admit to being slightly unusual as soldiers go, having never once stood in a trench after it was dug. You've also never had a job interview, likely in part due to being rather difficult to contact in Koltuk, Mbeya, Tarakan. The only calls you've ever heeded were those to the front lines, and excitingly, it appears that for once someone besides you knows where those are going to be. Even knows it well enough to call for you before fate does, though you can't claim to share their taste in interior design. KCDI's branch office looks strangely voguish to you. Vacuous, like every part of the layout and decor was chosen individually because it was on the cover of a magazine once. As though this wasn't bad enough, the magazines would have had to come from wildly different decades with wildly incongruous aesthetic sensibilities. You wonder what reason someone could have to build something so pointless in a future war zone. The receptionist doesn't seem to know. If she did, she probably would have quit. Doesn't know who you are, though, which gives you the creeps far more than any tacky office curtains. Says you have an appointment with Liam. No last name, nothing, just Liam. Though there's some discomfort with the syllables in her eyes, where the customer service mask reaches its curb, and that tells you some things, at least. Hold on a second, you say. They only even invited you to the city for next week, and sure as shit not with any sort of specific appointment. You work on your own time by nature, a free spirit, just here to scout the place out, and who in the ever-loving fuck is the Liam? She remains undeterred, despite the verbal assault. No. Like people waltzing in here with firearms isn't even a noteworthy occurrence to her. That's your slot right there, isn't it? The blonde asks while showing you a timetable. We tend to account for the idiosyncrasies of our contractors in order to reduce friction. It's all part of our company policy. Now please, take a seat. Liam will be with you in a moment. You can only conclude that someone way up high has decided to fuck with you, as you begrudgingly sit down on a bright orange beanbag overlooking the city. Shiny glass table, stylish indirect lighting, fucking beanbags exclusively, like a joke proposal someone with cash in place of sense took seriously. Never thought you cared about dignity, most good soldiers don't, but this place is testing your limits in ways you would have never thought to encounter. Last straws where you realize that the needle has been lodged in your palm the entire time, and relinquish the privilege of unmixed metaphors in favor of accuracy. Life is messy, but yours doesn't tend to be. Or at least not symbology-wise, just mess-wise. Trenches are often muddy even before they're dug. Oh, this won't do. You want to respond, but the idea is unraveled halfway through your brain by the realization that this woman has somehow made it into the office and close enough to touch your rifle without you noticing. She's not Liam, that's for fucking sure, but she's not normal either. That or a reconsideration of long-held beliefs about the superiority of your senses is in order. Not that you can make time for it. As gloved hands carefully probe the barrel for several full-blown moments until you can finally collect yourself and ask the lady whether she's suffering from a death wish, 'cause you sure could help her with that. Do you have a permit for that, Mr. Ashford? Don't answer, of course you don't. Wait a second. Even before she returns, you already know that she's one of those people who say a second and mean it. Difficult enough to find folks who mean anything these days, and those who go the extra mile to mean banalities are a few steps beyond comfort even for you. High-strung enough for the snap to be lethal. The fact that these whack jobs know your name isn't made less unnerving by repetition either. Here's your form. Please sign here for the firearm, and here for any other weapons or weaponizable objects you might be carrying on your person. Can I at least get a name? She seems to consider for a bit, like this is a profoundly strategic decision, capable of swaying the tide of battle any which way, and therefore finally gives you a chance to really look at her. Face isn't all bad, though it would benefit from being more emotive, less sedimental around the major zygomaticus. Unless tired counts as an emotion, that is, in which case she's nailing it. Perfectly unassuming, with the mid-length, side-parted hair and pantsuit, but she does appear to have read the style guide for this place, looking at the utterly incongruous novelty earrings that accompany her chosen uniform. Probably read the style guide before even showing up to a job interview. Seems the type. Maybe she wrote it. Any additional information is unlikely to be a good idea and pointless beyond that. Have a pleasant stay, Mr. Ashford. Have a pleasant... Too late. Whoever she was already dashed out the frosted sliding door like she has a note-taking appointment in the pencil-pushing gym scheduled for 3 seconds from now exactly. Well, anyone here, please tell me what the fuck is going on. A Tibetan monk-looking guy in a suit struts in as if on cue, his idiosyncratic existence sending ripples through reality, with such intensity that you get slightly nauseous. That'd be my job, I believe. Sorry to keep you waiting, it's rare enough that we get outside visitors in this city, much less ones of your stature. Truly, I would be understating the matter if I said that our organization is quite impressed with your work. Well, the honor goes both ways, I'm sure, Mr. Liam. Liam. Repeating the name, you really chew on the syllables, so as to convey to him your absolute state of seething disdain for the overwhelming paucity of names and answers provided in this place. But to properly get a feel for and ascertain how honored it is that I should be, Liam, it sure would be great if someone, you perhaps, told me what the shit it is that your company does and what it wants me for. Not that I don't already have some ideas about the latter, my field of expertise is kinda specific. As you probably know, what with how you have creepily chosen to know things folks aren't supposed to constantly, but that doesn't stop me from wanting to hear details, I hope you understand. Look as I might, Liam, I am not a fool. You don't look a fool, though I doubt you have come here for compliments. You look more like a... What would you describe yourself as? Soldier, you tell him, and he goes through his papers skeptical looking, like he doesn't already know what they say. You wonder about that. Can't be all too much written about you, so maybe they are just for show. Most things are. I am no expert, but soldiers are usually in the employ of a government, are they not? Yeah, but that's not how jobs work. Most plumbers are probably employed by a plumbing company, but they're not made plumbers by the nature of their employer. A soldier is someone who fights wars. A plumber is someone who works with plumbing. It's all ground level, all atomic. You are what you do and you do what you must. Anything beyond that is smoke screens with increasingly fancy labels slapped on to distract the idiots. And you don't do smoke screens. You tell him that if those files of his say anything, and you doubt they do, you'd imagine he'll find you to be rather too direct for such tactics. Or, more likely, you'd imagine that he has already come to this conclusion and is only fussing with the papers for style guides' sake. Something that, as you reiterate, annoys the ever-loving fuck out of you. Indeed. I suppose it is only fair for me to be straightforward as well, then. Mind if I take a seat? You nod, distrusting the capacity of anyone in the city to refrain from being a cryptic shit for literally any length of time. Liam plops himself cross-legged on the floor with significantly less grace than you were expecting, but at least the fact that he's willfully ignoring the god-awful beanbags is sort of respectable, and you'll take what you can get at this point. The communique you have received implies that we were hiring. That much is true. It also implied that we sent multiple, which is not. You will find that this is a job interview only in the vaguest of senses, and even though I am not in a position to tell you what exactly your assignment will be, I can tell you what sort of thing you are going to be doing. In fact, I will probably have to tell you what it is you have been doing so far. I know what I've been doing. Oh yes, and what would that be? My job. I see. He goes through his papers again. Irkutsk, then. Tell me about it. What were you doing there? Not much to tell. If he's expecting some grand story, he better lower his expectations, cause there is none. The grand story started after you left, and even that narrative shitshow isn't all that impressive to folks who aren't news media or relatives of the victims. Combat is so very trite if you look at it from a distance, through some LED crescendo cinematized facsimile of human suffering. Numbers and explosions don't do it justice. But you digress. You were traveling, just traveling. You're always traveling until you're suddenly not, and Irkutsk isn't even quite right with how he says it. You've never been to the city, though it was where you were headed. The Paris of Siberia, they call it, despite the Baikal around it being an ecological dead zone, thanks to the stranglehold of over-aggressive tourism. Well, not really despite, that's just another parallel to Paris. But either way, it's supposedly beautiful, but you've never made it there. You only were to the Irkutsk Oblast, farther south near Koltuk, where the Baikal curves to a knife point, while still being pure enough for shit to grow and thrive in its frosty bowels. Liam's face doesn't betray whether the name means anything to him, so you keep going. Might as well. The thing about Koltuk is that you don't usually pass through it as a tourist on your way to the administrative center. People arrive in Irkutsk by plane or via the Trans-Siberian, via the major arteries, while you were bubbling up through the capillaries that traverse the Mongolian steppe, only to supply sparse, desultory settlements. Sometimes you do air travel, it's not like you're committed to the wandering, but you don't like it. Always felt like people aren't supposed to have that sort of perspective. Top down. Detachment is a terrible affliction that aviation all too willingly spreads, so you chose the slow, laborious path at least somewhat intentionally. Suppose it makes sense, though, that you would have brought the Jud with you from the depths of the Gobi Desert. Calamity is the only kind of souvenir that suits you, and Andrei accepted it graciously enough when he showed you that bottling plant. Nice fellow. though when Liam asks, you can't tell him much about the guy, aside from his hair being basalt and his face mercilessly frost-weathered to make him look far older than he probably was. That, and that he hated the Chinese with a passion that must have been drained from all other fields of his life. Not really the people, not really the state, but something more abstract than that. Pure outside, some unfathomable accreted evil that found its physical manifestation, to him at least, in that factory you drove past. Liam would have hated it too, you tell him. It was the opposite of this place. Fitting. Boring. If you asked a random pedestrian to draw a bottling plant in Siberia, they likely wouldn't be too far off the mark. Just another dime a dozen steel-wrought monuments to industrialization that you ignore on the drive-by if you happen to be looking out the window. Maybe that made it worse to Andrei, how it pretended to belong. He didn't ask, but you can't imagine that there was any aspect of it he didn't hate. So that was surely among them. All of this despite the fact that it sort of really did belong. Chinese investment is everywhere up there in the east. Not so much in the population centers, sure, but in all those places on the periphery, where the state can't bring itself to give a shit for one solitary second, and where the oxygen is slowly depleting. See, the water is still good up there, nice and natural and clear enough that the Chinese would even want to bottle the Baikal, but that doesn't mean that ecological death hasn't set in. It just isn't in the water. It came from outside, came for the water, or that's how Andrei spun it. He was a clever enough guy. He knew that the factory wasn't so much greater a hell than any other one. The problem was just that it wasn't theirs. That it stood there, draining them, positioning itself as the economic centerpiece of the community like they should be thankful for it, and that it wasn't even theirs, while everything that was theirs was unremittingly rotting and leaving and dying. Had been doing that for a while now, since before he was born. The population of Koltuk halved between 1970 and now, and all those who stalwartly stayed behind knew that this trend wouldn't stop until there were just enough bodies left to operate that fucking plant. Fate must have known it too, in its tendrils, in its rhythmic ticking. It knew, or it wouldn't have called your name so softly.